The blood-soaked letter trembled in Olivia Mitchell's hands as she stood in front of the modest Wyoming homestead she'd fought so hard to build. April 1877 brought no spring renewal for her, only devastating news that her husband of 3 years had been gunned down in a dispute over water rights 2 counties over. Tears blurred her vision as she folded the letter, slipping it into the pocket of her dusty work dress. Knowing there was no time for grief with a farm to run and debts mounting higher than the distant Tetons. Olivia had once been known throughout Sweetwater County for her melodic laugh and bright smile, but as she pushed open the weathered door to the home she'd shared with Thomas, she couldn't imagine ever feeling joy again. The weight of running the small cattle operation alone pressed down on her shoulders like an anvil, and at 24 years old, she felt as ancient as the gnarled cottonwoods lining the creek bed behind the house. Miss Olivia. Her ranch hand, elderly Hank Peterson, approached cautiously from the barn. "I'm mighty sorry 'bout Thomas." Olivia nodded stiffly, unable to form words. Hank had been with them since they'd claimed this land, teaching them everything about raising cattle in the harsh Wyoming territory. But at 72, with arthritis gnarling his hands like twisted roots, he couldn't manage the hard labor alone. Neither could she. "I'll be staying on, of course," Hank said, as if reading her thoughts. "But we'll need help with the spring roundup. There's no getting around it." "We can't afford to hire anyone," Olivia said, her voice hollow. "The bank's already threatening to call in our loan." Hank shuffled his feet. "There's a cattle drive coming through from Texas next week. Sometimes those outfits shed a few hands along the way. Might be we could find someone willing to work for a roof and meals until we sell the herd." Olivia looked across the land she and Thomas had dreamed about since their wedding day in Illinois. 160 acres under the Homestead Act, 20 head of cattle, and a dream that had died with a bullet. She had 7 months to make the payment to the bank or lose everything. "We'll ask around," she conceded, though the thought of a stranger on their land made her stomach twist. "But only if absolutely necessary." For the next 5 days, Olivia worked from dawn until well after dusk, her hands blistering as she repaired fence lines and tended to the spring calves. Every muscle screamed in protest, but physical pain was a welcome distraction from the hollow ache in her chest. Each night she collapsed into the empty bed, too exhausted even for tears. On the 6th day, while attempting to free a calf caught in a thicket, Olivia slipped in the mud of the creek bank and wrenched her ankle badly. The pain shot up her leg like lightning, and for the first time since receiving the news of Thomas's death, she allowed herself to sob openly, not just for her husband, but for the impossible situation she found herself in. "You'll break that axe handle if you keep swinging like that," a deep voice called from behind her the following afternoon. Olivia whirled around, wincing as her injured ankle protested, to find a tall stranger leaning against the corral fence. His face was partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson, but she could see the hint of a beard and piercing eyes studying her with undisguised interest. "This is private property," she snapped, tightening her grip on the axe. The stranger pushed away from the fence and approached slowly, hands held slightly away from his body in a non-threatening gesture. As he drew closer, Olivia could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the revolver on his hip looked well-maintained. "Mason Miller," he introduced himself, removing his hat. "Your neighbor, Mr. Peterson, flagged me down when I was passing through, said you might need a hand around here." Olivia bristled. "Hank had no business, begging your pardon, madam, but he seemed mighty concerned about you trying to run this place alone with that ankle." Mason nodded toward her swollen joint, which she'd poorly wrapped with strips of an old petticoat. "I've worked cattle since I could walk. Spent the last 5 years driving herds from Texas to Kansas." Olivia's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "If you're with a cattle drive, why aren't you with your outfit? Something flickered across Mason's face, a shadow quickly controlled. The trail boss and I had a disagreement about the treatment of a young drover. I chose to part ways rather than watch a boy get beaten for dropping a pot of beans. Despite her wariness, Olivia felt a reluctant flicker of respect. "We can't pay much," she said cautiously. "Barely enough for room and board until the cattle are ready for market." Mason replaced his hat. "I'm not asking for much, madam, just honest work and a dry place to sleep." "It's Mrs. Mitchell," Olivia corrected him sharply, "and the bunkhouse hasn't been used in months. It'll need cleaning." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Reckon I can manage that. Where would you like me to start, Mrs. Mitchell?" Olivia hesitated, then pointed toward the broken fence line in the north pasture. "The cattle keep breaking through there. Fix that and we'll see how you do." As Mason walked away, Olivia couldn't help noticing the confident set of his shoulders, and the way he moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. For the first time in days, she felt a tiny spark of hope that perhaps she might not lose everything after all. Over the next 2 weeks, Mason proved himself to be a capable and tireless worker. He repaired fences, tended to the cattle with expert care, and even fixed the leaking roof on the barn that had been Thomas's perpetually postponed project. Each evening, he would retire to the bunkhouse after supper, respecting Olivia's privacy and grief. Olivia found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the efficient way he moved, the gentle handling of the animals, the quiet competence that seemed to emanate from him. She caught herself wondering about his past, the life that had brought him to her door, but pride kept her from asking one evening. As spring rains pounded the roof, Hank, Mason, and Olivia sat at the kitchen table after a simple supper of beans and cornbread. The old ranch hand had been regaling Mason with stories of the early days in Wyoming territory. "This land wasn't meant for farming," Hank was saying. "Too wild, too untamed." The Mitchells understood that, built up a fine little herd instead of trying to force crops from the ground. Olivia stared into her coffee cup, the mention of the Mitchells a knife twist in her heart. "How did you come to Wyoming, Mrs. Mitchell?" Mason asked, his voice breaking the momentary silence. Olivia looked up, startled by the direct question. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her, not as Thomas's widow or as the struggling rancher, but as herself. "I came west with my parents when I was 16, she said slowly. "They died of fever the first winter. I worked as a seamstress in Laramie until I met Thomas." "You left seamstressing for ranching." Mason's voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "I left it for love," Olivia replied simply, then stiffened, surprised by her own candor. Mason nodded, his eyes warm with understanding. "That's the best reason to do anything, I reckon." Something in his gaze made Olivia look away, uncomfortable with the sudden awareness of him not just as a hired hand, but as a man, one who looked at her with genuine interest. She stood abruptly. "It's getting late. We have an early start tomorrow." After Hank and Mason left for the bunkhouse, Olivia sat alone by the dying fire, Thomas's last letter in her hands. They'd been so full of dreams, the two of them. Now, at barely 24, she was a widow trying to hold onto the only thing left of those dreams, this land. The next morning, Olivia woke to find Mason already in the barn, tending to a calf that had been weakened by a difficult birth. He sat on a hay bale, the tiny creature across his lap as he carefully fed it from a bottle. "Didn't expect to see you up yet," he said without looking up. "Thought you might rest that ankle a bit longer." "There's too much to do," Olivia replied, noting with satisfaction that the swelling had gone down considerably. "Stubborn," Mason remarked, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Determined," Olivia corrected. "Determined, then," he conceded, finally looking up at her with those penetrating eyes. "You remind me of my sister. She had that same fire." It was the first personal detail he'd offered about himself, and Olivia found herself curious. "Had," a shadow crossed Mason's face. "Lost her and my parents to a Comanche raid when I was 16. Been on my own since." Olivia felt a surge of sympathy. I'm sorry, Mason shrugged, his focus returning to the calf. It was a long time ago, but it taught me that life doesn't always go according to plan. No, Olivia agreed softly. It certainly doesn't. Later that day, while checking the herd in the north pasture, they spotted a mountain lion stalking a newborn calf separated from its mother. Without hesitation, Mason drew his revolver and fired a warning shot, sending the predator slinking back into the tree line. The precision of his shot and the speed of his draw told Olivia that this man was more than just a ranch hand. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" she asked as they guided the calf back to its anxious mother. Mason holstered his weapon with practiced ease. Spent some time as a deputy in a town called Bitter Creek, learned that a warning shot often prevents having to take a life. A lawman turned cowboy. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Just a man trying to find his place," Mason replied. "Same as most folks out here." That evening, a violent spring storm rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a wounded animal, and rain lashed against the windows with unrelenting force. Olivia had just stoked the fire when a pounding at the door startled her. Mason stood on the porch, drenched and wild-eyed. The creek's rising fast, the lower pastures already flooding, and the cattle are panicking. We need to move them to higher ground. Without a word, Olivia grabbed her oilskin coat and followed him into the downpour. For the next 3 hours, they fought against the elements, herding terrified cattle through mud that sucked at their boots and rain that stung their faces like needles. Hank did his best, but his age limited him to manning the gate to the upper pasture. By midnight, they had saved most of the herd, but 3 calves had been swept away by the surging creek. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, they trudged back to the house. "You should get dried off before you catch your death," Mason said as they stood dripping in the kitchen. Olivia nodded wearily. "There are some of Thomas's old clothes in the chest in the spare room. They might fit you." When she returned from changing, she found Mason stoking the fire, dressed in her late husband's flannel shirt and trousers that were slightly too short for his frame. The sight of another man in Thomas's clothes should have bothered her, but instead Olivia felt only gratitude for Mason's presence tonight. "Those calves," she began, her voice catching. "We saved 27 head," Mason reminded her gently. "That's a victory, Mrs. Mitchell." "Olivia," she said suddenly. "You can call me Olivia. After tonight, Mrs. Mitchell seems unnecessarily formal." A slow smile spread across Mason's face, transforming it from merely handsome to something that made Olivia's breath catch unexpectedly. "Olivia," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. Something shifted between them in that moment, a subtle change in the atmosphere as palpable as the storm outside. Olivia turned away quickly, busying herself with making coffee, unsettled by her own reaction to his smile. They sat in companionable silence, letting the fire warm them as they sipped the strong, bitter coffee. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, leaving only the gentle patter of rain on the roof. "Thank you," Olivia said finally. "Without you here tonight." "You'd have managed," Mason replied with certainty, "but I'm glad I could help." Olivia studied him over the rim of her cup. "Why did you really leave that cattle drive, Mr. Miller?" Mason looked at her sharply, then his expression softened. "Mason," he corrected. "And what makes you think I wasn't telling the truth? A man with your skills could find work anywhere. Yet you accepted a position for room and board on a struggling ranch run by a widow." Mason set his cup down slowly. "The truth is complicated. I've found it usually is." He sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I was a deputy in Bitter Creek for 3 years. The town was run by a cattle baron named Harrington who believed the law was whatever he said it was. When he ordered me to arrest a homesteader whose land he wanted, I refused." Olivia waited silently as Mason gathered his thoughts. There was a confrontation. Harrington's son drew on me. I was faster. Mason's voice was flat. "I left before they could hang me, but Harrington has men looking for me. I've been moving from job to job, staying ahead of them." You killed his son in self-defense, Olivia said slowly. That's not murder. Not everyone would see it that way, especially not when Harrington owns the judge and half the territory. Mason looked up at her, his eyes troubled. I should probably move on soon. My presence here could bring trouble to your door. Olivia thought of the bank loan, the cattle that needed tending, the repairs still to be done. But more than that, she thought of the quiet strength this man had brought to her failing ranch and to her. Stay, she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. At least until after the spring roundup, we can face whatever comes. Mason's eyes widened slightly at her use of we, but he nodded slowly. Until the roundup, then. As spring progressed into early summer, the ranch began to thrive under their combined efforts. The remaining cattle grew fat on the lush grass, and the repaired fences and outbuildings stood strong against the elements. Hank taught Mason the peculiarities of the land where water could be found even in the driest seasons, which slopes were prone to rockslides, which trails the cattle preferred. And Olivia found herself noticing things she hadn't allowed herself to see before. The way the sunrise painted the distant mountains pink and gold, the sweet scent of wildflowers in the meadows, the sound of birds welcoming each new day. The crushing grief that had enveloped her began to recede, not disappearing but transforming into something she could carry without being consumed by it. She also noticed changes in herself. She began taking more care with her appearance, washing her hair with the lavender-scented soap she'd stopped using after Thomas died, mending her better dresses that had hung untouched in the wardrobe. When she caught herself humming while kneading bread one morning, the realization that life was continuing, that she was continuing, brought tears to her eyes. Mason noticed the change too. You're looking more rested, he commented one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. I'm sleeping better, Olivia admitted. The nightmares don't come as often, nightmares. Olivia hadn't meant to reveal that much, but found herself continuing. After I got the letter about Thomas, I kept dreaming about how he died, imagining his final moments, wondering if he called for me. Mason was silent for a long moment. I had those dreams too, after my family. Took years before they faded. Does the pain ever truly go away? Olivia asked, voicing the question that had haunted her. Mason turned to look at her, his face serious in the fading light. No, he said honestly, but it changes, becomes part of you rather than all of you. His words resonated with a truth Olivia was just beginning to understand. They sat in silence as darkness fell completely, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary conversation. The following day, while Olivia was in town purchasing supplies, she overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. Harrington's men were asking about a tall fellow with a beard, the shopkeeper told another customer. Said he's wanted for killing the boss's son. Offering $500 for information. Olivia kept her expression neutral as she paid for her purchases, but her mind was racing. Mason had been right, trouble was finding him, and now it might find her ranch too. When she returned home, she found Mason and Hank discussing plans for the upcoming roundup. She waited until the old ranch hand had gone to check on a pregnant heifer before approaching Mason. There were men in town asking about someone matching your description, she said without preamble. Mason's face hardened. Harrington's men, Olivia nodded. They're offering a reward. I should leave tonight, Mason said, already moving toward the bunkhouse. I never meant to bring this to your door. Olivia caught his arm. Running won't solve anything. They'll just keep hunting you. What's the alternative? Stay and put you and Hank in danger. Mason's voice was tight with anger, not at her, she realized, but at the situation. We need to clear your name, Olivia said firmly. There must be witnesses to what happened, someone who saw Harrington's son draw first. Mason shook his head. The only witnesses were Harrington's men. No one else will speak against him, they're too afraid. Then we find someone who isn't afraid, Olivia insisted. The territory marshal, perhaps, they answer to federal authority, not local cattle barons. Mason stared at her, a mixture of admiration and disbelief on his face. Why would you risk everything to help me? You barely know me. Olivia met his gaze steadily. I know enough. I know you're a good man caught in a bad situation. And I know what it's like to have everything you care about threatened. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Mason reached out slowly, his calloused fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with unexpected tenderness. You're an extraordinary woman, Olivia Mitchell, he said softly. Olivia felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't pull away from his touch. I'm just stubborn, she replied, echoing his earlier assessment. Determined, he corrected with a smile that reached his eyes. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. Mason's hand dropped to his sidearm as they both turned toward the road. 3 riders approached the ranch, their postures tense and purposeful. Olivia recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Taylor from the neighboring county, a man she'd met only once at a town meeting. Stay inside, Mason said quietly, his expression grim. No, Olivia replied, squaring her shoulders. This is my land, we'll face them together. As the riders drew closer, Hank emerged from the barn, shotgun in hand. He positioned himself on Olivia's other side, the 3 of them forming a united front as the sheriff and his deputies reined in their horses. Afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell, Sheriff Taylor called, touching the brim of his hat. Sorry to intrude on your property, but we're looking for a man named Mason Miller. Word is he might be working for you. Before Olivia could respond, Mason stepped forward. I'm Mason Miller. What can I do for you, Sheriff? The sheriff's hand moved closer to his holster. There's a warrant for your arrest from Bitter Creek, murder charge. It was self-defense, Mason said evenly. Harrington's son drew on me first. That's for a judge to decide, Taylor replied. I'm going to have to ask you to come with us peacefully. Olivia moved to stand beside Mason. He's not going anywhere with you, Sheriff, not without proper legal representation. Sheriff Taylor's expression hardened. Madam, this isn't your concern. Step aside. This is my property, and Mr. Miller is under my employment, Olivia stated firmly. Unless you have a properly executed warrant signed by a territorial judge, not one of Harrington's pocket justices, you have no authority here. The sheriff looked taken aback by her boldness. Mrs. Mitchell, harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. So is trespassing, Hank interjected, raising his shotgun slightly. And harassment. A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by the nervous shuffling of the horses. Olivia held her ground, heart pounding but refusing to show fear. Finally, Sheriff Taylor sighed. I'll be back with a territorial warrant, Mrs. Mitchell. You're only delaying the inevitable. Then we'll see you when you have the proper paperwork, Olivia replied coolly. Good day, gentlemen. As the riders departed, Olivia's knees nearly buckled with relief. Mason steadied her with a hand at her elbow. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen, he said, his voice a mixture of admiration and concern. Probably both, Olivia admitted, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But it bought us time. Time for what? Hank asked, lowering his shotgun. Olivia looked at Mason, determination hardening her resolve. Time to find someone who can testify to the truth. That evening, they formulated a plan. Mason would ride to Cheyenne to seek help from the territorial marshal, while Olivia and Hank would continue preparations for the roundup. If Mason wasn't back within 10 days, they would know something had gone wrong. As dawn broke the next morning, Olivia stood by the corral watching Mason saddle his horse. The early light cast long shadows across the yard, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage and pine from the distant hills. You don't have to do this, Mason said, tightening the cinch on his saddle. You could just let me ride out, start fresh somewhere else, and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. Olivia shook her head. That's no life at all. Mason turned to face her, his expression solemn. Why does it matter to you what happens to me? Olivia looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Because you've become important to me," she admitted softly. "More important than I expected, than I was prepared for." Mason's eyes darkened with an emotion Olivia couldn't quite name. He reached out slowly, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "When Thomas died," she continued, finding courage in his touch, "I thought that part of my life was over, that I would never feel anything again except grief and duty. And now—" Mason's voice was barely above a whisper. "Now I'm afraid," Olivia confessed. "Afraid of losing someone else I care about." Mason leaned down, his forehead touching hers. "I'll come back to you, Olivia Mitchell. That's a promise." For a moment they stood suspended in time, the world around them fading away. Then Mason straightened, his expression resolute as he mounted his horse. 10 days, he reminded her. "If I'm not back, you'll be back," Olivia said firmly, unwilling to consider the alternative. With a final nod, Mason urged his horse forward, riding toward the rising sun. Olivia watched until he was nothing more than a distant speck on the horizon, then turned back to the ranch house, a curious mixture of fear and hope battling within her heart. The next 7 days passed in a blur of activity as Olivia and Hank prepared for the roundup. They worked from dawn until dusk, mending the final sections of fence, preparing the branding irons, and ensuring the cattle were in good health. The physical labor helped keep Olivia's mind from constantly wandering to Mason's whereabouts, though each night she found herself sitting on the porch, scanning the horizon until darkness made it impossible to see. On the 8th day, Hank found Olivia in the barn, systematically cleaning and oiling every piece of tack they owned, a task that had already been completed 2 days prior. "He'll be back," the old man said gently. "That's a man who keeps his word." Olivia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had been foolish to allow herself to care for Mason, to let him pass the walls she'd built around her heart after Thomas died. Yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, the sound of approaching riders once again broke the quiet of the ranch. Olivia stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the glare, her heart leaping with hope that quickly turned to dread as she recognized Sheriff Taylor at the head of a larger group than before. Hank emerged from the barn, shotgun in hand, as the riders approached. This time, there were 6 of them, the sheriff, his deputies, and 3 rough-looking men Olivia didn't recognize. "Mrs. Mitchell," Taylor called as they reined in their horses. "I have here a warrant signed by Judge Wilson of the Territorial Court." He held up an official-looking document. "I'm authorized to search your property for Mason Miller and take him into custody." Olivia descended the porch steps slowly. "Mr. Miller isn't here, Sheriff. He left over a week ago." "Then you won't mind if we have a look around," one of the strangers said, his voice carrying a note of threat that made Olivia's skin crawl. "Who are these men, Sheriff?" she demanded. "They're not wearing badges." "Deputies from Bitter Creek," Taylor replied, though he didn't meet her eyes. "Here to assist in the apprehension." "Harrington's men, you mean?" Hank spat. "Since when does a sheriff need hired guns to serve a warrant?" The tension in the air thickened as the men exchanged glances. Olivia noticed with growing alarm that the strangers had spread out, effectively surrounding the house and barn. "We're going to search the property now, madam," Taylor said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I suggest you and your hand stay right here while we do." Olivia stood her ground. "I want to see that warrant, Sheriff." Reluctantly, Taylor handed over the document. Olivia scanned it quickly, her heart sinking as she recognized the official seal. It appeared legitimate, leaving her no legal grounds to refuse. "Very well," she conceded stiffly, "but I'll accompany you." "This is still my property." The sheriff nodded curtly, and 2 of his men dismounted to search the house, while the others headed toward the barn and bunkhouse. Olivia followed the men into her home, watching with simmering anger as they roughly opened drawers and closets, showing little respect for her belongings. "He's not here," she repeated. "I told you he left days ago." The search revealed nothing, of course, and the group eventually reassembled in the yard. The storm was moving closer, thunder rumbling in the distance like the growl of some massive beast. "Where did he go, Mrs. Mitchell?" one of Harrington's men demanded. "I don't know," Olivia lied smoothly. "He didn't share his plans with me." The man took a threatening step toward her. "I think you're lying, lady." "That's enough, Daniels," Sheriff Taylor interjected, though his reprimand lacked conviction. "Mrs. Mitchell, harboring a fugitive or aiding in his escape is a serious offense." "If you know where Miller went, I've told you all I know," Olivia interrupted firmly. "Now, unless you plan to arrest me based on suspicion alone, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property. We have a storm coming and cattle to secure." The standoff might have escalated further if not for the sudden sound of approaching horses. All heads turned toward the road, where a group of riders appeared through the gathering gloom. Olivia's heart leaped to her throat as she recognized Mason at the head of the group, sitting tall in the saddle despite the obvious exhaustion etched on his face. Beside him rode a distinguished-looking older man wearing a marshal's badge, and behind them, 4 deputies. "Afternoon, Sheriff Taylor," the marshal called as they drew closer. "Bit far from your jurisdiction, aren't you?" Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Marshal Williams, I'm serving a warrant for the arrest of Mason Miller on behalf of the Bitter Creek authorities." "That warrant has been rescinded," Williams replied, producing a document of his own. "New evidence has come to light regarding the death of James Harrington Jr." Olivia moved forward, unable to take her eyes off Mason. He looked at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch, reassuring her without words that he was unharmed. "What evidence?" Taylor demanded, clearly thrown off balance. Marshal Williams dismounted, handing the paper to the sheriff. "A sworn statement from Robert Collins, a former deputy from Bitter Creek who witnessed the confrontation. He testifies that young Harrington drew first and that Miller acted in self-defense. Collins is a drunk who got fired," one of Harrington's men spat. "His word ain't worth nothing." "His word is supported by 3 other witnesses who have come forward now that they're under territorial protection," the marshal countered smoothly. "The case against Miller has been dismissed by Judge Wilson himself." The sheriff read the document, his expression souring. "This seems to be in order," he admitted reluctantly. "Then I suggest you and your men return to your own county, Sheriff," Williams said, his genial tone belied by the steel in his eyes. "And remind the gentleman from Bitter Creek that impersonating lawmen in this territory is a hanging offense." Thunder cracked overhead as if emphasizing the marshal's words, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. With visible reluctance, Taylor signaled to his men, and the group departed, Harrington's men casting dark looks over their shoulders as they rode away. As soon as they were out of sight, Olivia rushed forward, heedless of the rain now falling in earnest. Mason dismounted in one fluid motion, meeting her halfway across the yard. "You came back," she said, rain mingling with the tears she could no longer hold back. "I promised I would," Mason replied, his voice rough with emotion. Marshal Williams cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could continue this reunion somewhere drier. My men and I have ridden a long way." Laughing through her tears, Olivia welcomed the marshal and his deputies into her home. The next few hours were a flurry of activity, as she prepared food for the hungry men while Mason explained what had happened in Cheyenne. He had found the territorial marshal receptive to his story, particularly when Mason mentioned the name of a judge who had previously tangled with Harrington over water rights. The marshal had agreed to investigate and, through his contacts, had located Robert Collins, who had witnessed the shooting but fled Bitter Creek fearing Harrington's retribution. Collins wasn't the only one, Marshal Williams added as they sat around Olivia's table. Once word got out that the territorial authority was involved, 3 other witnesses came forward. Seems Harrington's son had quite a reputation for drawing on men when he had the advantage. "And Harrington himself?" Olivia asked, pouring coffee for the weary men. The marshal's expression turned grim. He'll face charges of his own for obstruction of justice and attempting to bribe territorial officials. His days of ruling that county are over. Later, after the marshal and his men had been settled in the bunkhouse, and Hank had retired for the night, Olivia and Mason found themselves alone in the kitchen. The storm still raged outside, rain lashing at the windows and thunder shaking the little house, but inside was warmth and safety and something else, something new and fragile blossoming between them. "I thought I'd lost you," Olivia admitted softly, "when those men came today." Mason moved closer, taking her hands in his. "For years I've been running from place to place, never letting myself put down roots, never letting myself care too much about anyone or anything." Olivia looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes that matched her own. "And now I find myself thinking about things I haven't allowed myself to consider in a very long time," he said, his voice low and intense. "A home, a future, someone to build that future with." Olivia's heart hammered in her chest. "Mason, I know it's too soon," he interrupted gently. "I know you're still grieving for Thomas. I don't expect anything from you, Olivia. I just want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'll be here. For as long as you want me to be." Olivia felt tears welling in her eyes again, but these were different from the tears of grief she had shed so often in recent months. These were tears of possibility, of hope reborn. "Stay," she whispered, echoing her words from weeks earlier, but infusing them with new meaning. "Not just for the roundup, not just to help with the ranch. Stay because this is where you belong now." Mason's smile transformed his face, erasing the weariness and worry of the past days. With infinite tenderness, he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be," he said softly. The storm outside seemed to fade into insignificance as Mason lowered his head, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. Olivia's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, allowing herself to truly feel for the first time since receiving that blood-stained letter. When they finally parted, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you threatened me with an axe," he admitted with a soft laugh. "I wasn't threatening you," Olivia protested, her cheeks flushing. "I was just being cautious." "Stubborn," Mason corrected with a grin. "Determined," Olivia countered, feeling a smile, a real, genuine smile spread across her face. "There it is," Mason said, his voice filled with wonder as he traced the curve of her lips with his thumb. "What?" Olivia asked, confused by his sudden intensity. "Your smile," he explained. "Hank told me once that, before everything happened with Thomas, you had the brightest smile in 3 counties, that when you laughed it was like music." Olivia ducked her head, unexpectedly self-conscious. "That was a lifetime ago." Mason gently tilted her chin up, his eyes warm with affection. "A life can have many chapters, Olivia. The end of one doesn't mean there can't be beauty in the next." And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and peace finally settling within her heart, Olivia found herself believing him. The summer of 1877 passed in a blur of hard work and new beginnings. The roundup was successful, with more calves surviving than Olivia had dared hope. With Mason's expertise and connections through Marshall Williams, they secured a better price for their cattle than the local market usually offered, providing enough income to pay off the bank loan and make necessary improvements to the ranch. Mason stayed, as he had promised, working alongside Olivia from dawn until dusk. Their relationship grew gradually, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He never rushed her, understanding that her heart needed time to reconcile the love she still held for Thomas with the new feelings blossoming for him. By the harvest moon of late September, the transformation of the Mitchell ranch was remarkable. New fencing surrounded the expanded pastures, the barn roof no longer leaked, and the house had received a fresh coat of paint. Most noticeable, however, was the change in Olivia herself. The grief remained, a part of her that would never completely vanish, but it no longer defined her. She found herself laughing more frequently at Hank's tall tales, at Mason's dry observations, at the antics of the new puppy he had brought home from town to help with the herding, though they both knew it was because she had mentioned missing the dog she'd had as a girl. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Mason turned to her with an expression she had come to recognize, one that meant he had something important to say. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice carrying that slight hesitation that only emerged when he was truly nervous. "A dangerous pastime," Olivia teased, enjoying the smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Dangerous indeed," Mason agreed, taking her hand in his. "I've been thinking about names." Olivia tilted her head questioningly. "Names for the ranch," he clarified. "The Mitchell Ranch was Thomas's dream, built on his and your shared vision. If I'm going to be a permanent part of this place, a permanent part of your life, perhaps it deserves a new name, something that honors the past but looks to the future." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat at the thoughtfulness behind his words. "What did you have in mind?" Mason reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden sign, clearly hand-carved with meticulous care. On it were burned the words "New Horizon Ranch." "Because every day brings a new sunrise, a new beginning," he explained softly. "But only if we're brave enough to look toward the horizon instead of dwelling in shadow." Tears pricked at Olivia's eyes as she traced the letters with her fingertip. "It's perfect," she whispered. Setting the sign aside carefully, Mason took both her hands in his. "There's something else I've been wanting to ask you," he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate tone that never failed to send a shiver down her spine. Olivia's heart began to race as Mason slid from the bench to kneel before her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Olivia Mitchell, you brought me into your home when I was little more than a stranger. You stood by me when it would have been easier to turn away. You taught me that it's possible to find hope even in the darkest times." His voice grew husky with emotion. "I love you more than I ever thought possible, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life making you smile." From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he explained, "the only thing I have left of her. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Olivia could barely see through her tears as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her reach. Mason slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all that was to come. That night, as they lay tangled in each other's arms in the bedroom that had once been a place of sorrow for Olivia, she found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought Mason to her door that spring day. How a single moment of courage, his decision to stand up for what was right in Bitter Creek, her decision to hire a stranger, had altered both their lives irrevocably. "What are you thinking about?" Mason asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Olivia propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, drinking in the sight of his face in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "I was thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best ones if we just keep going." Mason smiled, pulling her closer. "Wise words from a wise woman." "I have my moments," Olivia replied with a playful dignity that made him laugh. As his laughter filled the room warm and rich and full of life, Olivia marveled at how far they had come. From a widow who believed she would never smile again, and a man running from his past, to two people building a future neither had dared to imagine. They were married on a bright October day, with Marshall Williams officiating and Hank proudly giving Olivia away. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by neighbors who had come to respect the determined young widow and the man who had helped her rebuild not just her ranch, but her life. As winter settled over the Wyoming territory, bringing with it short days and long, cold nights, The newly renamed New Horizon Ranch stood as a beacon of warmth and hope. Inside the snug house, Olivia and Mason created new traditions while honoring old ones, finding the delicate balance between remembering the past and embracing the future. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside and a fire crackled in the hearth, Olivia presented Mason with a gift, a framed deed to the ranch with both their names listed as owners. "This belongs to both of us now," she said, watching his face as he realized the significance of what she had done. Equal partners in everything, Mason set the frame aside carefully before pulling her into a fierce embrace. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed against her hair. "A home, a wife, a purpose." Olivia leaned back to look into his eyes. "Remember what you told me when I asked if the pain ever truly goes away? That it becomes part of you rather than all of you." Mason nodded, his gaze tender. "I've been thinking about that," Olivia continued, taking his hand and placing it over her heart. "The love I had for Thomas will always be part of me, but it's made room for the love I have for you, a different love, but just as real and just as strong." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Mason assured her. "Your capacity for love, even after such loss, that's one of the things I admire most about you." Olivia smiled, then took a deep breath, preparing to share the news she had been keeping close for several days. "That capacity might need to expand a bit more in the coming months," she said with deliberate casualness. Mason's brow furrowed in confusion, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Olivia, are you saying—" "Dr. Parker confirmed it yesterday," she nodded, her face glowing with happiness. "We're going to have a baby, Mason, in late June, if his calculations are correct." With a whoop of joy that startled the puppy sleeping by the fire, Mason lifted Olivia off her feet and spun her around, his face alight with wonder and excitement. When he set her down, his hands cradled her face with infinite tenderness. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And now this miracle too." As they stood together in the warm glow of the fire, snow falling silently beyond the windows and the promise of new life growing within her, Olivia thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The grief that had nearly consumed her, the chance encounter that had changed everything, and the single word that had started her heart beating again. Determined, Mason had called her that stormy night, with respect in his eyes where others might have seen only stubbornness. It was the first time since Thomas's death that someone had truly seen her not as an object of pity or a problem to be solved, but as a woman of strength and courage. And in that moment, against all odds and her own expectations, Olivia Mitchell had found herself smiling. The years that followed brought both joys and challenges to the New Horizon Ranch. In June of 1878, Olivia gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas James Miller, honoring both her first husband and Mason's father. The boy had his mother's honey-colored hair and his father's keen eyes, and from his earliest days showed the same determined spirit that had drawn Mason and Olivia together. Hank Peterson remained with them until his peaceful passing in the winter of 1880, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom and stories that they promised to share with young Thomas and any siblings who might follow. The old ranch hand was buried on a gentle rise overlooking the creek, beneath a cottonwood tree where he had often sat smoking his pipe and watching the sunset. In the spring of 1881, their family expanded again with the arrival of Sarah Elizabeth, a strong-willed little girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's bright smile. Mason proved to be a devoted father, teaching his children to ride almost as soon as they could walk, telling them stories of his travels, and instilling in them the values of honesty and courage that had guided his own life. The New Horizon Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, gradually expanding as they acquired neighboring properties when older settlers decided to return east or move on to other frontiers. By 1885, their herd numbered over 200 head, and the Miller brand was known throughout the territory for quality stock. Through it all, Olivia and Mason's partnership deepened, weathering the inevitable storms of life with the same resilience they had shown during that first spring together. They disagreed sometimes, both being strong-willed individuals with definite opinions, but never went to bed angry, finding compromise and common ground in their shared vision for their family and their land. On the 10th anniversary of the day Mason had first ridden onto the ranch, they hosted a gathering for friends and neighbors that lasted well into the night. As the celebration wound down and guests departed, Olivia found Mason standing on the rise near Hank's grave, looking out over the ranch that had become more than either of them had dreamed possible. She approached quietly, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts, cowboy." Mason smiled at the endearment, squeezing her hand gently. "I was just thinking about all the twists and turns that brought us here, how different things might have been if I'd ridden on past that day, or if you'd been less stubborn, determined," Olivia corrected with a grin. "Determined," Mason acknowledged, pulling her close against the evening chill. "How did I get so lucky?" Olivia leaned into his embrace, watching as the setting sun gilded the landscape they had nurtured together. "I don't think it was luck," she said thoughtfully. "I think sometimes the heart knows what it needs, even when the mind isn't ready to admit it." Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "Your heart is wiser than most, Mrs. Miller. It found you, didn't it?" Olivia teased, turning in his arms to face him. "That it did," Mason agreed, his expression growing more serious. "And I thank God every day that it did." As twilight deepened around them and the first stars appeared in the eastern sky, they stood together in comfortable silence, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced all others together, with determination and love. The ranch that had once been a place of sorrow had become a sanctuary of joy, filled with the laughter of children, the warmth of friendship, and the deep, abiding love between two people who had found in each other the courage to begin again. And if anyone in Sweetwater County wondered at the transformation of the once grieving widow into the vibrant, laughing woman who now rode beside her husband with such obvious happiness, they needed only to hear the story of a spring day long ago, when a stranger's single word had rekindled the spark of life in a heart that thought it would never know joy again. Determined, he had called her, and determined she had been to survive, to rebuild, to love again. In the end, it had made all the difference.